Hello, welcome to Varn Blog Solo, and today I'm answering one request and developing another. So let's talk about the request I'm answering and what I'm developing here. One thing I have complained about all the time is I sometimes feel like I'm Dr. No of the left, that I sit down and look at the facts and say, analytically, what you're doing is misguided or it's monolithic in a way that's going to stop you from being successful, or it's just flat wrong. On the other hand, I also present ideas to the public in the terms of interviews, largely sympathetic interviews. I will push back, as I think a journalist, although I don't consider myself a journalist, is required to do on facts. But on theory, I think we have to answer the theoretical claims by letting them be fully articulated sympathetically before we critique them. Hence, the relationship I have with modern monetary theory. I often have modern monetary theorists on, and yet it is clear that I don't entirely agree with them. Yet I'm not fighting them all the time because I think there's probably 80 to 90% of a worldview of which we share. Let's talk about that worldview. One, uh, I agree with modern monetary theories that in an international market, strong sovereign powers can effectively issue their own currency because they can compel people to buy their production. But to do that, they need to have built up a massive productive apparatus and a fairly large military apparatus. This is what creates the context for which you can move from a currency that is based on a commodity that is transferable to a currency that is based on a promise, a fiat, a statement by the state. Classical political economy and neoclassical economics assume that barter and the is where the origins of money comes from and not the state. We can actually see that barter relations are actually quite rare in societies before the development of modern nation states. That barter really only happened between competing societies who did not have high trust situations. So you didn't barter within your local village or your hunter gatherer band or your pastoral group because you are in a high trust situation. And in a pastoral society, you're likely to be dependent on things like honor tokens for successful raids. In a hunter gatherer band, you're likely to be fairly equal, with power being exchanged provisionally and equality being somewhat actually enforced, etc. Now, you know, this means that I actually do think the neo-chartalists are onto something, as is the legal theory of money people onto something, in that trade can be facilitated by something other than a bartered commodity, because trust relations of debt and credit really are the origins of most internal economic exchange. That's pretty clear even in Marshall Sahlins' Stone Age economics. Now, why do I bring this up? I was asked to respond to my interview with Rowan Mosler because I presented it mostly sympathetically. One, Mosler was very kind enough to give me all of his time. Two, I actually do think there are some insights Mosler can pack that almost no one else can pack as clearly as him. However, there are some points where I either am not sure that I agree with him or not, or I think need to be worked out. One, for example, is do bond rates actually shrink the money supply? There is some evidence, and I'll show it to you, from the Federal Reserve Bank that it does. Right, but not very effectively. And we could talk about why that would be the case. Now, this does not mean that I think Warren Mosler is completely wrong in his assertion that the payouts on these things are still somehow keeping the fallout of the economy fairly okay. but we have to deal with the fact that bonds pay out full interest in time. And because of that, bonds do temporarily shrink the available money supply if enough of them are bought, because you're spending money now to get more money later. So they're a temporal decrease. All right. So what does that mean? Well, taxation, according to Keynes, and I think Keynes is right about this in terms of fiat money, will shrink the money supply. Directly, 1-to-1, just takes it straight out of circulation. But that's politically unpopular. It's a blunt instrument. So monetarism is a way to do Keynesianism without doing Keynesianism, and in fact saying you're rejecting Keynesianism, which is why also modern classical and non-heterodox Keynesians tended to be concessionary to monetarist policy, and what they think should be different is what the goals are. All right. So this neo-Keynesian turn, after Samuelson and whatnot, gives up on this idea that you can use taxation because it's just politically non-viable. And we'll get to the problem I have with all these theories in a minute. And let's get into mediations, because that's going to be important. All right. But that temporally speaking, there's a tendency to say that bonds will just pour the money straight out of the economy, and that's not true. That is how the Fed shrinks the money supply, but it's a rather stochastic and indirect shrinking of the supply. But let's look at what the stats are for this. This is just from Trading Economics, so you can contend with me about sources, but this is the money supply here. All right, money supply M1 in the United States decreased to this huge sum of money from this other huge sum of money in January. The money supply has averaged this huge sum of money from 1959 until 2004, reaching an all-time high in April of 2022 and a record low in 1959. So this is the recent, although this graph, of course, makes it seem more dramatic than it is. We have to be careful about graph measures, right? Because this is all within. Okay, but this is the recent decline of the money supply. So here we have a money supply of 9K USD billion. And then we have 18.6K USD billion. To today, you have 17.9K USD billion. So there is a shrinking of the overall money supply right now, at least according to what is being released by the Fed. This is not a very effective way to shrink, though, because bonds do pay out, and they pay out consistently, and they're tradable. But they're tradable at current valuation, not at their full valuation, which means that the relationship to the money supply is a little bit more opaque than either the Fed or I think Warren Moser, who are opposed here, would say. Which leads us to a bunch of questions. Why, when we talk about the interest rate, do we not talk about the fact that the interest rate does pay out? Well, because it's regressive. It gives money to bondholders. Bondholders almost necessarily have money. And remember, who has the money for massive amounts of bonds? Usually rich traders and investors. Although individuals are also invested in the bonds through mutual funds, traditional bond buying, although individuals buying straight up, bonds is probably less common now than it was in the past. But I used to have old bonds which paid out very differently than new bonds. And so I can think about how this works. Like my greatest generation era grandparents and my silent generation era grandparents, I think, would buy us bonds for Christmas. It was like a weird World War II hangover thing, but we had them. And the older ones actually valuated quite differently than the newer ones. All right. And my parents did that because, I mean, my grandparents did it because they did that after the Depression and during the war, even though they were working class people. I mean, my grandfather was literally a bricklayer, a brick maker too. Like that's what he did. So this was not a bourgeois profession, but it does kind of illustrate the way bonds used to play into the economy of Fordism as a way of saving. That could be passed down even if you were relatively poor. The bond payout rates have been so low for so long that pattern has kind of now relied to people who use them for trading and speculation. And so the relationship to the money supply to me, even though it does seem to take money out, doesn't take money out cleanly because these bonds are also being paid out on at all times and reducing Fed funds, which they clearly are. Okay, so this means that higher bond payouts matter, but the relationship to time didn't seem clarified to me in Mosler's discussion, because in the short run, selling bonds with high interest rates would decrease the monetary supply, but as those bonds mature, it would re-increase them later. And that would be a way to temporarily offset the time so that you hope that other things would offset inflation later on. I hope that makes sense. So I feel when like Warren Mosler says that there's something truth to the bond payout in that we're not calculating. I think that's absolutely true. But what is unclear to me is what the timing of that has to do with the overall money supply. And that's beyond my pay grade to exactly figure out, because that's not something you can even catch entirely in a single balance sheet. And one of the things that you have about these debates is they're based on balance sheets without dealing with the context for those balance sheets. You have people who want to throw all these things away. Colin Drum famously doesn't think that GDP and stuff doesn't matter. I can argue that, yes, you can have a functional and highly successful economy that has a no GDP because it produces everything it needs and doesn't need to grow. That wouldn't be a capitalist economy, though. So GDP has no relationship to the way humans actually thrive in an economic market, but no one says it does. One of the responses I got to Mosler was Mosler saying the economy is doing well, got a lot of people mad. Well, the economy is doing well for upper class, bourgeois, and highly invested types. It is. But it's not doing particularly well enough. We've seen a spring of business bankruptcies this year, and that is only increasing, and that is a worldwide trend. The exception is China, but partly because China makes it really, really hard for businesses to declare bankruptcy. They often have to just reformulate on loans for a much longer time before they can be fully cleared, or they get taken over by the state. So China stats are a little different, although China's also seen an uptick in bankruptcy despite its severe limits on how bankruptcy happens. I say all this, though, to make a theoretical point, because I talked about why I don't do gotcha interviews. And if and that doesn't mean I don't do hostile interviews or interviews where I push back on people. Sometimes I think it's important to clarify differences. But where I am less certain of correctness, I tend to be a little bit more less certain on pushing back. And I will tell you, the more I look at this money supply issue, it is opaque to me what is actually going on. If you want to pull out fiat currency from the economy, the best way to do it is taxation. That is highly unpopular, even though we have seen taxes increase. There's a little tax bomb in the Trump tax cuts that it's hidden now. So how do you do that? And also, there's a tendency to tax according to Keynes, and I think this is true enough. When things are bad, and to not tax when things are better. But that's actually like the opposite of what you should be doing. High taxes when things are good, low taxes when things are bad. And In the United States, it's hard to even figure out our taxation regime because taxes are, for us, are often hidden in federal schemes and fees and outsourcing. Other people just pay their taxes from, etc. There's all kinds of tax shenanigans. We have an unbelievably complicated tax code that is mitigated by the fact that it also has separate tax codes for 50 states that have radically different laws. Where does this leave us here? What does it have to do with kings? Well, there's another tendency in MMT that I like to call the tendency for class collaborationism to lead to Bonapartism, i.e., the tendency of trying to hold classes that have antagonistic interests but are neither working class in the sense that they're not totally tied into production or even social reproduction in a clear way, nor are these people in highly successful, high profit ends of the economy that go up to scale. So we talk about this in the petit bourgeoisification of a lot of society, the petit bourgeoisification of the working class, etc. A lot of that actually means that to maintain profitability, you have to have someone intervene in the market, and that someone tends to be a singular sovereign because classes of people through the legislature have a hard time doing that, even when you assume both parties are capitalist classes and they're interested in capital management. And yes, a true crisis of capital will get them together to do something as quickly as anything else, more than most other serious needs of society. See also how in 2007 and during COVID, that those actions were taken very quickly, whereas to keep the economy going, whereas, things like figuring out how to fix the Medicare system, immigration, anything else for basic social functioning that even other states can do, we can't do right now. Tells you a lot, though. And when we talk about this in terms of mediation of society, we have to talk about why class collaborationist politics tends to try to get down oligarchical gridlocks in bureaucracy and whatnot, and competition between classes as manifested by the legislature, of which the various rich classes have a distinct advantage, be they rentier or bourgeois or even well-off elite professional, because they can pay for lobbying, which is how Congress can continue to get reelected. But all that aside, we have to ask ourselves a few questions about mediation. What is this money telling us? And I think here we actually have to almost think about the genre of what is hidden in money. And I say genre here because in some ways textual analysis can help you see what's in this discourse as represented by a fetish, in this case, a dollar. All right. What are the different things coming out about that? So one of the things we have right now is we have very low unemployment, but we have an increasing amount of the population, particularly women, completely leaving the employment sector and not being counted in employment because they're not trying to get work. A lot of them are becoming stay-at-home moms because the cost of care services right now is so high that literally childcare is becoming more expensive in some areas than university per year. I think I've seen some evidence that childcare right now can have $21,000 a year. Well, given where our poverty line is, the cost of childcare actually exceeds the poverty line for one person. You can see how this is going to be a problem, right? So you have more and more people opting out of the economy. So when we talk about why the workforce has shrank, it wasn't the Great Resignation, although some of that was true at the end of the period of generous unemployment benefits. It was baby boomers being forced out because of fear of getting sick, lots of death. I mean, we lost over 1 million people, and excess deaths. And childcare got so expensive that people effectively have to leave the workforce over it. And then you have lack of immigration and declining birth rates. That's a recipe for a shrinking workforce. But if payouts and inflation are eating that up, like in the 1970s stagflation period, what you'll see is probably people aren't unemployed, but they also are still, but they aren't making enough money, so they have to work more and more and more, which keeps them out of the streets. Now, I don't think this is planned, but this should be noticed that while, the unrest of the 1930s and 40s up until the war in the United States had to do with high levels of unemployment. Whereas in the 1970s, you had some unemployment, a fair amount of unemployment, but you had stagflation, which is stagnant employment and inflation. So people had to work more and more members of the household entered the workforce. It is no small thing, as Christopher Lash pointed out somewhat correctly, that Betty Friedan feminism and entering the workforce became a big deal at the same time when inflation mandated that more parts of the family enter the workforce. Now, right now, we have a situation where people cannot really live off of one income, but also they can't afford to work. So for a lot of people, this is going to feel like parts of the family having to stay home more and other parts of the household having to work more, including kids. And have you not seen the removal of child labor restrictions in red states? It's probably not going to fix their labor problem, but they do have a labor problem. Now, this leads me to the Young Kings part. Because these are effectively class collaborationist politics, including the jobs guarantee. The jobs guarantee, on one hand, does more to help the working class than almost anything else, because it would make the job market inelastic, which is also why it's never going to happen. But on the other hand, it would make people dependent on basically legislative fiat by people from other classes to decide what the pay is for that jobs guarantee is going to be. And it makes them thus dependent on the bourgeoisie and ruling class adjacent people, all right, to keep that job guarantee wage up enough for it to have an effect. So the job guarantee both increases working class power, but also decreases working class agency. So does UBI, by the way, which is why Marxists historically were very iffy on these things. Now, Marx actually talked about the right to work as a jobs guarantee for something we should be advocating for, but precisely because it exacerbates class tensions, right? Not because it's actually a viable policy, which is where my critique of MMT has largely come from in the past is twofold. One, I still have not gotten satisfactory answers to how small states who are not super productive can force people to take their currency at the set value within the small state or at a free floating value that doesn't disadvantage them against larger currencies. I've never seen an explanation for how to fix that other than the spectrum of sovereignty. And the spectrum of sovereignty pretty much means figure out a way to act like an empire without being one. And I have lived through states. I lived in Egypt when the currency collapsed, when they stopped pegging their trade internally to get better loans from the IMF and from the Chinese banks, because the Chinese banks also required it. And it caused a currency collapse. It has slowly rebounded, but the idea that I used to be told that this was only because people were deliberately pegging their stuff to the dollar, well, that wasn't true in that case. I still go back to that when I think about when we're talking about MMT conventions for small countries. Is it impossible? I don't know. But it seems like for this to happen, you'd have to have either the states stop competing with each other, or the bourgeoisie of the world being invested enough to allow that to happen, or you're not dealing with a capitalist economy anymore. In which case, great, but then the one neat fix of currency isn't going to be the only, and a jobs guarantee isn't going to be enough, and a land tax. I also don't think anyone should own land, including the state, by the way. This is a classical Borges position, but it's one that I actually agree with, that land should be seen as the common property of all humanity, or of all life. And our relationship to extraction from the land has to take that into account. I don't get into growth or degrowth debates because I think they often miss the point. But this interclass competition leads to a want of a singular outsider to come in and mediate. And that's where these two books actually have a lot to help you in the problems of MMT. This book is Graeber and Solons's on Kings. I greatly prefer the Solons part of this, although Graeber was a student of Solons, and also Graeber's early work was often published by Solons's presses. But I find Solons to be a much more sophisticated and, frankly, honest thinker. And then the dialogical imagination by Bakhtin, because we have to think about what genres of mediation actually do. Now, this is not the way Marxists normally talk about this, even though, we can talk about totalities or whatever, but there is a certain amount of Marxists who are epistemic idealists, in that they think the ideas of Marxism are invariant, unchangeable, not just about economics, and really about some abstraction like the revolution for bourgeois rights, or the struggle against the invariance of Marxism, or whatever. I'm going to go into a lot of these theories more. I know I've come down hard on Borgism in particular in the past, and I'm going to come down hard on parts of it again. There's also parts of it I think that are uniquely insightful in the Marxist tradition. So we're going to talk about that and why, there's a tension in the development of Borges thought and the idea of programmatic invariance. But also, there's been a lot of people lately trying to pull up parts of Marx and Engels' whole cloth and just assert that it is true off of a textual reading, even though these are about factual claims like barter or the thumb or, whatever. This is an incredibly bad way to understand reality. It is effectively book worship. And I think while Marx and Engels are ahead of the game on so many things, to freeze them in time like that, particularly on factual claims, is a very dangerous move. But similarly with MMT, all right, there's a tendency to present MMT as a non-ideological development, and that it's just describing reality. Although one of the things that you have to deal with for MMT to work is to figure out how they use terms differently than other kinds of economics, including other kinds of heterodox economics. Right, because a lot is hidden in the norms used to decide terms, even if you're being descriptive and you're separating things out. Because again, like I said, you can't, I've said this 1,000 times, you can't collapse a norm into a description, but you also can't separate them, because norms actually give you the ways you describe reality. Like, the problem with the is-ought distinction is oughts actually give you the words you use to describe the is, but you can't derive the ought from the is one-to-one. Never the twain shall meet. Which creates a tension in that we are always striving to get better to describe the world. But there's a reason why I say empiricists tend to sneak in, and I think Slavoj Žižek of all people actually made this observation, sneak in contemporary biases because they don't question the categories that they're using. Mediation matters, and in the mediation, there's a plethora of hidden factual realities that come up in different voices within the mediation. So the ways we talk about money hide many different things. I think Roy Moser's form of MMT is very clarifying on a lot of stuff, but it's mystifying on others. Class relations, for one of them. No description of the economy and our sociology or anthropology at any given point is going to not sneak in norms, because it sneaks in both perspective and vocabulary. And this has to be dealt with. But there are many things hidden in those perspective and vocabularies, and what are you supposed to do is find them. Now, that's the critical part of this. That's the analytic part of this. But the reason why you do this is to build something. We're not here to just win the factual debate between Marxism and MMT. I mean, in some sense, who the fuck cares, nerds? We are here to figure out where we are now and what could be politically useful for bringing about a classless society, if that is our teleos of politics, which for a communist, I think it is. Right? Everything else, to me, isn't totally negotiable, but it does have to be viewed as part of that relation. Like, a classless society also would not have certain other kinds of oppressions and distinctions, because they would effectively lead to other forms of class. A classless society may have divisions of labor, but those divisions of labor can't be instantiated and made so rigid that they become definitional to who you are, because then that again is a class, etc., etc., etc. This is our goal. This is our orientation. Everything else we deal with has to materially relate to that. I would love to believe in the Hegelian sense that this would just happen because the natural unfolding of economies leads this way, through the tensions of class conflict, but class conflict only being able to be mediated in one of two ways, which is common ruin and our progression towards something else. I would say that simple view of the dialectics is naive. We have to look at the plethora of tensions that emerge and how to deal with them. You want to deal with why the working class can't get together? You have to deal with that. You want to deal with understanding the tensions in bourgeois politics and why there is real competition and why bourgeois politics does matter? You have to deal with the multiple voices in that too. None of these things speak in a singular voice. None of these things act with a singular will. They only appear to an aggregate. And yes, aggregates make history. That is a Marxist point. Marx says it explicitly. But you can't just analyze from that standpoint. And also, you can't just do interviews to gotcha on people on minor things that you're not sure about. Like, I am sure about the class collaboration nature of MMT leading to some things I don't like. Either technocratic orientation or Bonapartism, depending. And you will see these tendencies happen over and over and over again in different forms of chartalism. All right. That's not unique to them. There are also tendencies in Marxism this way. Like, the dictatorship of the proletariat either leads to like a view of class democracy that is totally expansive, or a party state, or an individual dictator. Those are all possible and somewhat valid interpretations of the way Marx and Engels use the term, because there's ambiguities in the term itself. We can't bracket out the ones we don't like just because we don't like them. That is not a good way to think. So when I talk about the multiple possibilities and tendencies in MMT because of the class conflicts being hidden in them, we also have to deal with the multiple problems of Marxism, or socialism, or communism, even beyond that. All right. We have to see these as emergent conflicts and deal with them as such. Because otherwise, someone's going to deal with them for us, and it's likely to be some king figure, real or imagined. And that's the Solon's point. Something will mediate the relation. Understanding mediation of relations, even as the emergence to class, is crucial for understanding tensions within classes. That's an anthropological project for good and ill, as well as a sociological one. And with that, I hope I've clarified and also expanded your definition of what we're doing here. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You want more, there's more behind the patron wall. Take care.